Welcome to the Global Amateurs Podcast,
a site where we explore mindsets,
motivations,
and methodologies of
international relations.
Hi, I'm Haikal and I'm in charge of graphic design, and so I come up with all of the posts on our Instagram and also all of our logo and stuff.
I am Rees and I am responsible to manage our budget and also handling our social media platforms such as Spotify and YouTube.
I am Ainie. My job in this project is to prepare relevant materials and handle the project documentation.
My name is Salsabila Azahra. I handle documentation and provide relevant materials.
Hi everyone, I'm Norman Sim from Global Ambitious Podcast, and I manage the budget for the podcast and handle the social media platforms such as Instagram, Spotify, and as well as YouTube. Besides that, I coordinate the expert Q&A podcast series that we recently launched, and I coordinate and as well as communicate with our guest speakers.
Our main objective of producing this video was to be free to describe our journey on our ongoing podcast project. For your information, we focus on the assistance of COVID-19 and international relations as the main topic of our discussion. In this video, we will also explain the background of our project, the reason why we choose podcast as the platform, findings and recommendations, and of course, we will end our video with the conclusions and hopes from us. In this video, we will review the informations and results obtained from the episode by episode that we discuss and have the different issues. This is in line with the objective of our project, which is to provide information on COVID-19 that said be able to influence international relations in the current global society in terms of health diplomacy, politics, and the latest economic crisis.
I'm here from Global Amateur Podcast, and today I'll be delivering you a gist of an introduction about our social engagement project, which is the Global Amateurs Podcast, and the problems faced throughout our social engagement project. Just to start things off, Global Amateurs Podcast is unique to the sense that we deliver contents based on international relations, COVID-19, and as well as diplomacy-related issues. We deliver this through our podcast platforms via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and as well as YouTube. Besides that, we also utilize social media platforms such as Instagram to actually notify our audiences about upcoming podcasts. But many people do ask, why choose podcasts? So let me tell you a bit about the rationales of us choosing podcasts as our main social engagement tool. Based on reports by Podcast Insights in 2020, approximately 43 million people in this world are active podcast listeners. 1 out of 5 people in Malaysia listens to a podcast program via Spotify. And also, it is also stated that because of the lockdown that is occurring, it has contributed to 31% increase of podcast listeners in Malaysia itself, making this one of the fastest growing medium or tool to spread out information, vital news, and as well as data. Because of that, we decided to make the right move and utilize this tool to its fullest capacity when it comes to engaging with society. To ensure efficiency during the process of conducting our social engagement project, our group had created a duty rosters, which indicates the members' responsibility in hosting the podcast, poster making, podcast episode uploading to our podcast platform, and as well as content creations. Contents for each week were created by me with the approval of other members to ease the flow of conducting our podcast. In total, we managed to produce 3 podcasts featuring all of us, me, Haikal, Rees, Ainie, as well as Salsabila, 2 expert Q&A podcast episodes with our guest speakers, and 1 special podcast which actually features our members and as well as collaborating partners from international universities, especially from Germany, France, and as well as Indonesia. Despite that, we have faced many challenges throughout our social engagement project. These challenges varies from internet connectivity issues, guest speakers unavailability, and as well as lack of manpower. Well, this is basically due to the unprecedented departure of one of our members who actually held a vital role in our social engagement project. But nevertheless, we continued our social engagement project as usual, overcoming challenges along the way by organizing weekly postmortems to identify the challenges and solving them prior to our upcoming podcast content. Hence, I can say that this actually explains how we are here today. Thank you very much.
So, in the first episode of our Global Amateurs podcast, we actually discussed about vaccine inequality. And in that episode, we tell people about how vaccine inequality is this really unmoral, unethical thing that is going on right now in the world regarding like vaccine distribution globally, on how richer countries they got prioritized in terms of distribution as opposed to like poorer countries. And we can see even sometimes in some cases, some countries, the richer countries, they have placed orders for vaccines that is enough to vaccinate their entire population, sometimes twice, 3 times, or even 5 times over. And that is actually concerning given the fact that some other poorer countries, they don't even have secured enough vaccine to vaccinate, I don't know, 10% of their population. And this problem is actually really grave in a way that there is an initiative to actually combat this. It is called COVAX. And if you want to know more about it, you can just feel free to listen to that first episode. I swear to God, that is one of the longest episodes that we have, and it is worth it. Go listen to it.
The second episode of our podcast was handled by me, Ainie, and Salsabila. The scope of our podcast at this season focused on Syria, and the title is Covid-19 in Syria. We began our discussion with the early incidents of the spread of COVID-19 in Syria that led the Syrian president to close the border and the public area. In general, we focus on the challenges that faced by Syria, including Syrian refugees, to facing the critical situation due to COVID-19. Among the challenges that they need to face is the lack of health facilities and the health equipment such as face masks. Since Syria is a country that facing the political conflict, the situation also made it more challenging to prevent the coronavirus transmissions. With the large number of refugees in the camp, they find it quite difficult to maintain the social distancing as told by the World Health Organization. The lack of water supply also made it difficult for them to maintain the power hygiene to control the COVID-19 infection. But they need to face the challenge because they have no other options, especially for the refugees. Some may ask why they do not seek the treatment in the hospital. Actually, the hospital in Syria not 100% functioning. 50% is functioning, 25% are not functioning, and 35% are partially functioning. Because of this, the spread of COVID-19 is hard to prevent effectively. However, we also find that half the aid was channeled to Syria by the various parties such as countries and related organizations. For example, China donates the new medical supplies to Syria in order to against COVID-19. The aid raised and donated by the voluntary organization in eastern Chinese province of Zhejiang that include the face masks, protection suits, and ventilators. The UAE also provide medical supplies to Syria. So far, the podcast that titled COVID-19 in Syria tell the real situation of COVID-19 that happening in there, and several representatives from several countries have also voiced this to help Syria in order to against COVID-19.
Hello everyone, I'm Lamin Sim, and I'll be giving you a short summary about episode 3. Episode 3 was eccentric compared to the rest of the episodes before, as this was in conjunction with our launching of the Global Amateurs Expert Q&A podcast series. This podcast series invites guest speakers who are experts in their respective field of conduct or research to discuss issues pertaining to their field. However, we did not possess any connections with any formidable speakers. Therefore, the conquest of actually obtaining one began. As the coordinator of the Expert Q&A podcast series, I have outsourced multiple speakers, but none actually responded. Despite that, I was able to actually get in touch with Mr. Muslim Imran, a PhD student in our department, as well as the chairman of the Palestinian Cultural Organization of Malaysia, or also known as PCOM. He has conducted multiple research onto the Palestinian struggle and as well as the Hamas political party. Not only that, but actually he has also appeared on many interviews on RTM TV3, and as well as Astro Awarni. To secure a date of recording wasn't really easy because he was a busy man, but in the end, we managed to. On the 30th of April, we, as in me, Haikal, Rees, Ainie, and as well as Salsabila, conducted a podcast recording session with Mr. Muslim. The topic discussed was the current state of Palestine under the oppressive regime of the Israeli state during the pandemic. Indeed, it was rather sensitive, however, we managed to divert all sentiments from our informational session with Mr. Muslim. Generally, the podcast session focused on three main areas, which are Palestine, Israel, and the United States. From the Palestinian side, the discussion focused more onto the COVID-19 cases as well as the inoculation programs, whereas the Israeli side centered on discussions on the inequality of inoculation processes compared to Palestine, and as well as the impedance and also the negligence and as well as the oppression towards the Palestinian people in their occupied territories. Um, well, basically, Mr. Muslim actually provided a lot of vital on-ground information about the situation in Palestine and its occupied territories. He has revealed that Palestinians are facing apartheid, gradual ethnic cleansing, sanctions, and as well as police brutality, as we've seen right now. Furthermore, the discussion went on to the questioning of the legitimate status of Hamas as a terrorist organization. And Mr. Muslim actually answered with a really strong no, and as well as quoted saying that if Hamas is a terrorist group, then all Palestinians defending their rights should be labeled as a terrorist group. As we approach the end of the discussion, the questions start to heat up. And one of it was actually pertaining to the two-state solution of the Palestinian and also the Israelis. The question was basically just about whether the two-state solution was actually a feasible solution, which actually Mr. Muslim answered in a very polarized manner, where he says that there's a slight chance of this two-state solution, especially with the Americans, siding the Israelis economically, militarily, and also politically. Not just that, but also vetoing every resolution against Israel during the United Nations Security Council. But one thing for sure is that during the podcast, Mr. Muslim actually managed to predict one thing right that actually happened recently. He actually predicted a slight possibility that there might be a two-state solution, a peace process that might occur for the Palestinians pertaining to this issue, especially when we've seen in this recent Palestinian-Israeli conflict that is still ongoing with the ceasefire and all that stuff. And just not only that, but also last but not least, before we actually ended our podcast and all, we actually asked him to give out his message as a hope to the Palestinian people, which he did. And that's all for my summary right now. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Episode 4 of our podcast was handled by me, myself, Rees, and Norman. The scope of our podcast at the session focused on China, India, and Israel about free vaccine rollout. In the beginning of this episode, we started it with an introduction to current vaccine rollout and also analysis of free vaccine focusing on China, Israel, and India. From this, we know that Israel have the highest percentage of vaccinated population due to many factors. We also discussed about impacts of free vaccine rollout to the country and briefly touch on vaccine diplomacy. In addition to that, we have discussed about ways taken by China, India, and Israel in order to attract the citizens to get vaccinated. This is really interesting as they have used many methods to make sure they achieve their goal. We conclude our podcast by hoping that everyone will get their vaccination shot in order to slowing down the spread of COVID-19.
So here in episode 5, we discuss about conflict and COVID-19 in Latin America. Here are the information. The demonstration in Colombia in proposed to against increased taxes, corruption, and healthcare reform during pandemic. This was happened because of the controversial statement he's made by President that tax rises were needed as response to the economic crisis which caused by pandemic. Although the president has withdrawn the tax reform, the demonstration is still continuing for 3 weeks long. The reasons why demonstration continuing is because besides tax reform matter, the protesters also focusing on poverty, inequality, unemployment, and lack of education in Colombia. This demonstration will lead to the increasing case number of COVID-19, but the society doesn't really mind since they also got another bigger problems.
So our sixth episode is basically our final episode, and so we decided to go for a more casual route. So what we did was we invited 4 students from 4 countries. We have from France, 2 from Germany, and 1 from Indonesia. And basically what we did for that episode is basically we just have a very casual discussion on the pandemic experiences that is faced by every single one of these students back in their home country. So basically, it is so interesting to know all of this first-hand account. For instance, we discussed about the COVID policy that they have in their country, how about travel restrictions and everything. We also talked about like how are they coping with all of this, with online classes and everything, and also the lockdowns. And it is really interesting, that episode, and I believe that we actually really wrapped up the Global Amateur series in a way that is so lighthearted, and I'm sure that our audience is gonna love it.
The spread of the new coronavirus is testing out a globalized world. The world of diplomacy is particularly affected by this development, as meetings, conferences, and other major events are cancelled. During times of crisis, international cooperation is more than essential. Driven by necessity, diplomacy is adapting. For the first time, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund (IMF) will host their spring meetings online, and also other international organizations. We can see that even international organizations are having difficulties in adapting to new norm. So everyone has a role to play in slowing the spread and protecting themselves, their family, and their community. In addition to practicing everyday steps to prevent COVID-19, keeping space between you and others is one of the best tools. We have to avoid being exposed to this virus and slowing its spread in community. Together, we are stronger.
So we got several challenges that we've encountered throughout this project. So the first challenge has got to be, we have problem at first with our Anchor. Like Anchor is this software that allows you to distribute podcasts, and we can also record our podcast on there. However, we realized that if we were to record like simultaneously 2 to 3 persons simultaneously, it's gonna cause some sort of audio distortion at the end of the day. Second problem is actually regarding our internet connectivity. So basically, we all have like different internet connections. So when we come up together and try to record a podcast episode, so a poor internet connectivity by one person could affect the entire recording. So that is the second problem. And the final problem is our scheduling conflict. So we actually have guest podcasts. So we not only have to like adhere to the schedule of our guests, we also have to adhere to like everybody else's schedule to ensure that there are no schedule conflicting. And that is quite a tricky one.
The conclusion is, after we have released several episodes which contains of what has happened during pandemic in a country, how their policies and what their steps to overcome the pandemic, it can be concluded that each country and government has its own efforts to solve this. However, in some cases, such as countries which currently in conflict, they are somewhat constrained to implementing the COVID-19 SOP, since their main problem is not only COVID. Therefore, we hope that all the efforts have been made to eradicate COVID-19 will be successful and the situation can slowly recover. We global amateurs hope
Our listeners could receive the points that we have delivered.
And it brings our listeners to another level of spirit in learning.
Hopefully, our presence attracted listeners to get to know more about COVID-19 and diplomacy.
Also being one of the reasons to keep your curiosity on learning.
Lastly, we hope our podcast could prove that learning method in exciting way exists.